G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. We're looking at the book of Hosea. Thank you for coming along. I pray it'll be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you. So welcome back to this session. Tonight we're looking at Hosea chapter 10, verse 1 to 12, verse 14. When we finished a couple of weeks ago, we finished off in chapter 9, and we were just going to recap on chapter 9. The prophet was warning Israel that there'd be a time coming where there'd be no more joy in the land. And the reason was because of Israel's adultery. Like Hosea's wife, which we've forgotten about Hosea's wife, but Hosea's wife was an adulteress. She has played the harlot. And just like an adulterous wife is stripped, so Israel will be stripped. The coming exile, they're going to go into a coming exile into Egypt and Assyria. Now that she has proven to be an adulteress, she's going to be stripped of her produce of her land, and she's going to be sent out of her land, her home, and she's going to go into Egypt and Assyria. Now, Israel were using the Mosaic festivals, the ones that God had ordained. She was using them not to honor God, not to honor the God of Israel, but actually she was using those festivals to honor their idols. And so because of that, and because of the constant idolatry and their adultery, the spiritual adultery, Israel is going to undergo divine discipline. The false prophets that they had are going to be proved to be fools because of all the things that they prophesied would just not come to pass. And their own wickedness is going to be shown to be very great, these prophets. Israel actually were the ones who led against the true prophets and against the house of God. If you remember, Amos went up into Israel to prophesy, and he was told to pack it up and go back home. We're not interested to hear what you have to say up here. Go back to Judah. Israel has become so corrupt at this time that they're like in the days of Gibeah. Now, remember the sin of Gibeah was so horrendous. They almost wiped out the tribe of Benjamin because of that sin of Gibeah. And what's happened now is the whole nation of Israel has become as bad as Gibeah. We saw Israel's infidelity initially when God found her in the wilderness. They were a real delight to him. They were like, sweet, fresh grapes to him, refreshing. And then at Sinai, where they were given the Mosaic law, they were very fruitful. And it was at Sinai that they promised to obey him, obey God. But then they came to a place called Baal Peor. And there they corrupted themselves with foreign gods of the Moabites. And for their punishment, Ephraim, which means double fruitfulness, actually became fruitless. Remember, when we talk about Ephraim, Ephraim is synonymous with Israel because she is the largest tribe in Israel. Now, she whose name means double fruitfulness actually became fruitless. There was no birth, no pregnancies, no conceptions in the land. And this was all a punishment for their idolatry. Again, we have their apostasy at another place called Gilgal, and that's one of their idolatry centers. And the result of all of this is that God will now drive them out of the land, and they will become wanderers amongst the nations. They'll be scattered. So we come to tonight's session where we'll be looking at the fall of the kingdom, and we look at this in chapter 10, verses 1 to 15. This is the northern kingdom we're talking about. And he starts out in the first 3 verses, he's continuing the theme of chapter 9, which we just covered just briefly then, which is Israel's corrupted fruitfulness. Israel is a luxuriant, this is verse 1, chapter 10, Israel is a luxuriant vine that putteth forth his fruit. According to the abundance of his fruit, he hath multiplied his altars. According to the goodness of their land, they have made goodly pillars. Their heart is divided. Now shall they be found guilty. He will smite their altars. He will destroy their pillars. Surely now shall they say, we have no king, for we fear not Jehovah. And the king, what can he do for us? So now in one way, double fruit has become fruitful in verse 1. But double fruit has been fruitful only in multiplying altars. And these altars are idolatrous altars. And that's the only area they've shown any fruitfulness, in multiplying idolatry. So in verse 2, we see that their heart was now divided. And so they halted between two opinions, between the worship of Jehovah and idolatry. And the result of this is going to be a divine judgment on all these idols. They are destined for destruction. In verse 3, we see that the kings that have taken authority, these were kings who usurped authority, in which they appointed apart, because they were appointed apart from divine appointment or prophetic sanction. Remember, in the northern kingdom, to be a king, you had to have divine appointment or prophetic sanction, which was prophetic sanction was from God. Now, these kings who have usurped this authority and appointed themselves, these kings won't be able to help them in that day. And this king was not divinely appointed. Therefore, this particular king here was not divinely appointed. Therefore, God will not use such kings to save his people, because they're not his kings. And in verse 4, we see that they speak vain words, swearing falsely in making covenants. Therefore, judgment springeth up as hemlock in the furrows of the field. So what we see here is that retribution is to fall upon both the idol and the king. And in verse 4, the judgment is going to come because of Israel's false covenants. Here again, he begins describing a judgment which involves more than simple captivity in Assyria. The kind of judgment that we're going to see here will come in the Great Tribulation. The Great Tribulation begins because of one false key covenant, and that's a covenant that Israel, the leaders of Israel, makes with the Antichrist. And we can find that in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and also Isaiah 28, verses 14 to 22. And the judgment that is going to be so severe had its roots in Israel's tendency towards idolatry. That's where it all stemmed from, their idolatry. But in verse 5, we see here that the inhabitants of Samaria shall be in terror for the calves of Beth-aven. The people thereof shall mourn over it, and the priests thereof that rejoiced over it for the glory thereof, because it is departed from it. So he prophesies here the fall of the idols of Beth-aven, which is the same again as Bethel. Remember, Bethel's name was changed to Beth-aven. Now, when this day, because of their idolatry, when this day comes, it will cause fear among the inhabitants of the capital city of Samaria. And all the priests who worship these idols will now mourn. And in verse 6, we see it also shall be carried unto Assyria for a present to King Jareb. Ephraim shall receive shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his own counsel. So in verse 6 here, he points out that to Israel's shame, they will be carried away to captivity. Now here again, he mentions that King Jareb, as he mentioned what we saw back in the earlier passage, which we talked about. And this is the King Jareb that they try to hire. They try to give him presents. They try to make a covenant with him. Yet he is the one who's going to take them away into captivity. In verse 7, as for Samaria, her king is cut off as foam upon the water. The high places also of Avan, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. The thorn and the thistle shall come up on their altars, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. So all of Israel's centers are going to be, their idolatry centers are going to be destroyed in verses 7 to 8. And the people become so fearful because of the persecution, because of the judgment, that they'll be running up to mountains saying, cover us, and the hills fall on us, hide us. In the book of Revelation, this statement is quoted as being fulfilled during that period, during that tribulation period. So Hosea does what he did once before. What he does here is that he moves from an immediate judgment, which is the Assyrian captivity, to a future judgment, which also involves the same geographic location, and in this instance, it's Mesopotamia. Whereas the immediate judgment is something they tried to avoid by making alliances against Assyria, in the future, they're going to make an alliance with it, but it produces the same results. Judgment, but a far more severe judgment in the future. Now they run to the mountains seeking shelter, and they yell to the hills, cover us over so no one can find us. And in verses 9 to 11, he once again picks on Gibeah to show his example of Israel's sin. O Israel, thou hast sinned from the days of Gibeah. There they stood. The battle against the children of iniquity doth not overtake them in Gibeah. When it is my desire, I will chastise them, and the people shall be gathered against them when they are bound to their two transgressions. And Ephraim is a heifer that is taught, that loveth to tread out the grain. But I have passed over upon her fair neck. I will set a rider on Ephraim. Judah shall plow, Jacob shall break his clods. So again here, what we see in verse 9, he again centers his attention upon that sin of Gibeah, which we find in Judges chapter 19, verse 22 and onwards. Judges 19:22. And what he's doing here is that he's emphasizing the terribleness of that sin. And that led to a tribal war, because all the other tribes came against Gibeah and against one tribe, the tribe of Benjamin. Now, the tribe of Benjamin before this war numbered as high as 26,700. And when this is the fighting men. And when that war against Gibeah and Benjamin by the other tribes was over with, the tribe of Benjamin was reduced down to only 600 males. That was it. Out of 26,700, only 600 remained. The other 26,100 were killed by the other 11 tribes. And their sin, this sin that the Benjamites did in Gibeah, was considered so hideous, they were willing to wipe out virtually the whole tribe of Benjamin as punishment. But now what was true of Gibeah, the sin of Gibeah has become characteristic of the whole nation, the whole northern kingdom. Remember, the sin of Gibeah was the pack rape of the Levites' concubine. The men had become so immoral homosexually that they wanted to have relations with the Levite in the Benjamite's house, but he wouldn't allow that, so he put out the concubine instead, and they simply raped her and she died. And it was a horrendous sin for that time. So now in verse 10, how much more will God now punish Israel with that same severity? And the tribulation judgments are going to be that severe, and Zechariah 13:8-9 points out that 2/3 of the Jewish population of that day will be killed. Israel is bound, she's enslaved to two transgressions, that of Gilgal and Beth Aven. This was their two idolatry centers. And in verse 11, and Ephraim is a heifer that is taught, that loveth to tread out the grain. But I have passed over upon her fair neck. I will set a rider on Ephraim. Judah shall plow, Jacob shall break his clods. Yeah. Because of it, in verse 11, that now leads to loss of privilege because of this, how sinful they become. Formerly, they were free to tread the grain. That's what you're talking about Ephraim here. She was free to, tread the grain, tread out the grain. And God pictures Israel or Ephraim like a heifer that was not muzzled, and that was in keeping with Deuteronomy 25:4. Why wasn't she muzzled? Well, because as she was treading out the grain, she could eat all she could, and she would. But now, as part of divine judgment, that privilege is now taken away. And he says that he will pass over her fair neck, which means he's going to put a yoke upon Israel. Now she'll be ridden, and now she'll have to labor and to plow. No more just treading the grain and eating as you go. And then in verses 12 to 15, he gives an example of what Israel can expect in her future judgment. And it's the example of Beth Arbel. Beth Arbel. Verse 12. Sow to yourselves in righteousness, reap according to kindness, break up your fallow ground. For it is time to seek Jehovah till he come and rain righteousness upon you. To give a clear example here of to know what to expect when God judges Israel so severely, he reminds them of the judgment that happened at the place called Beth Arbel. In verse 12, there is a call to Israel once again to repent, turn around, turn back to God. Now, following the massive, severe judgment of the tribulation described in the previous verses, where they become enslaved as well, also brought out by Zechariah 14, verses 1 to 2. Now he calls upon her to sow righteousness, and they must break the fallow ground. And the means of breaking the fallow ground is by means of seeking Jehovah their God. They need to do this so that he can come and rain righteousness, R-A-I-N, righteousness, repeating the promises that he made back in chapter 6, verses 1 to 3, about the early rain and the latter rain, so that they must return to him as a nation. He'll come to them as the rain, as the latter rain that waters the earth. But he cannot come with this rain of righteousness until they repent, until they sow righteousness, plow kindness, and seek Jehovah. They need to change their minds about who the Messiah is. And verse 13, you have plowed wickedness, you have heaped iniquity. You have eaten the fruit of lies, for thou didst trust in thy way, in the multitude of thy mighty men. Therefore shall a tumult arise among thy people, and all thy fortresses shall be destroyed, as Shalman destroyed Beth Arbel in the day of battle. The mother was dashed in pieces with her children. So in verse 13 now, Hosea reminds Israel how she has been. She has plowed wickedness. She has reaped iniquity. She ate the food of lies and trusted in her own ways and trusted in her own mighty men. That's why that severe judgment came. And when that judgment comes, what will it be like? In verse 14, it will be like that which happened at Beth Arbel. Now, Shalman is known in history as Shalmaneser the fifth. And this was King Shalmaneser, an Assyrian emperor. Now, he came into Israel to a place called Beth Arbel. Today it's called the Cliffs of the Arbel, a very high cliffs which overlook the Sea of Galilee. It's a straight drop of about 1,000 feet down. Now, Shalmaneser, when he captured all the Jews, including women and children, he brought them to the cliffs of the Arbel and he threw them off. And they were crushed and dashed to pieces on the rocky bottom. That's what had happened recently under Shalmaneser. And he points out Israel can expect a similar massive destruction and hideous deaths in the future. So shall Bethel do unto you because of your great wickedness. This is verse 15. So shall Bethel do unto you because of your great wickedness. At daybreak shall the king of Israel be utterly cut off. So in verse 15, we see here that there'll be no help from Bethel. Remember, Bethel is the source and cause of the coming disaster with her idolatry. Bethel was one of those idolatry centers. Wickedness will be destroyed. The king will be killed. The only place they can find help is in the God of Israel. Now, we've seen the judgment. Now we see God's love for Israel in chapter 11, verses 1 to 11. Three things here. First of all, in verses 1 to 4, he's going to give a historical summary. He's going to point out how God's love has been extended to them in the past. In chapter 11, verse 1 to 4. Well, verse 1 to 3 first up. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. The more the prophets called them, the more they went from them. They sacrificed unto the Baalim and burned incense to graven images. Yet I taught Ephraim to walk. I took them in my arms, but they knew not that I healed them. In these first 4 verses, he reminds them of his previous love, which they had experienced in the past. And in verse 1, he was the one who brought them out of the land of Egypt. He refers to Israel as his son because Israel, even when she was in Egypt, when he was in Egypt, was considered the son of God. And we see that in Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 to 23. Israel is my son, my firstborn. And because he was the national son of God, he brought Israel out of the land of Egypt and out of slavery. And in fact, we see this particular verse in Exodus quoted in Matthew 2, verse 15, where he talks about Jesus coming out of Egypt. However, in verse 2, although he sent prophets to them, although God sent prophets to Israel so they can be taught, they chose to follow the god Baal. And in verse 3, God taught them and God healed them on more than one occasion, though they refused to recognize who he was. He continued to try to teach them, although they did not know it was their own God who had actually healed them. Now, remember Hosea's wife. We've forgotten about her for a while, but similar to Hosea's wife, Gomer, she didn't realize that her many good things were coming from Hosea either. And now in verse 4, I drew them with cords of a man, with bands of love. And I was to them as they that lift up the yoke on their jaws. And I laid food before them. So second, we see in verses, we're going to see in verses 5 to 7, he points out that nevertheless, in spite of all that God did for them, Israel repudiated God's love, knocked it back. In verse 5, they shall not return into the land of Egypt, but the Assyrians shall be their king, because they refuse to return to me. So Israel repudiated God's love, and in verse 5, though they had a desire to return to Egypt because they felt that Egypt would be a better place to live, they won't return to Egypt, at least not in the state that they wish. On the contrary, they are destined for the Assyrian captivity, and those who do make it to Egypt, he says the form they're going to be going down there as is captives, not to make a better life. They're going to be going down there as captives to be slaves. Now, their failure to return to their own God will result in the Assyrian captivity. And in verse 6, it says, and the sword shall fall upon their cities and shall consume their bars and devour them because of their own counsels. So in verse 6, because they followed their own advice, their own counsel, not the prophets of God, their cities are now destined for destruction. And in verse 7, and my people are bent on backsliding from me. Though they call to them will they call them to him that is on high? None at all will exalt him. So in verse 7, he spells out the root problem here. They were bent on backsliding. There was something in them that was corrupting, something crooked that they couldn't straighten out. So once this judgment hit, though they may call on the God of Israel, there'll be no answer. He won't be answering them. And now, in verses 8 to 11 of chapter 11, we see the restoration of love in the future. Although God must discipline and judge his people, even with the Assyrian captivity in the immediate future and in the tribulation, the distant future, nevertheless, he promises a final restoration, and it will be a restoration of God's love upon them in the future. In verse 8, how shall I give thee up, Ephraim? How shall I cast thee off, Israel? How shall I make thee as Admah? How shall I set thee as Zeboim? My heart is turned within me. My compassions are kindled together. I will not execute the fiercest of mine anger. I will not return to destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not man, the Holy One in the midst of thee, and I will not come in wrath. Verse 10, they shall walk after Jehovah, who will roar like a lion, for he will roar, and the children shall come trembling from the west. They shall come trembling as a bird out of Egypt, and as a dove out of the land of Assyria, and I'll make them to dwell in their houses, says Jehovah. So the basis of all this is verse 8, God's compassion for Israel. He asks questions which the answer is obvious. How can I give you up? How can I cast you off, Israel? God's compassion for his people will never, ever allow a total annihilation, a total destruction. His anger, his wrath, his judgment, his discipline might require portions, sometimes large portions. And some of them, well, large portions will die. And one of those instances even in our modern history is the Holocaust. Hitler's aim was not 6 million. Hitler's aim was 18 million. And that's something God will never, ever allow. He will not allow for total destruction. He would not allow Israel to become like the two cities of Admah and Zeboim. Admah and Zeboim were two cities destroyed along with Sodom and Gomorrah. We often think in terms of him destroying only two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, but there are actually 5 cities in the plain, 4 of which were destroyed in the same judgment, and that included these two, Admah and Zeboim. And you can have a look at this you can compare this in Genesis 14 verse 8, Genesis 14 8 and Genesis 19 25. So Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim were all destroyed totally. There was nothing left. But he's not going to let that happen to Israel, because in verse 9, God will simply not extend the fullness of his anger. If he does, then there'll be a total annihilation, but that is something he will never do. His anger will be extended, but not to the fullness of total destruction. And in verse 10, they shall walk after Jehovah, who will roar like a lion. The roar of the lion precedes restoration. Notice again, we see the lion motif preceding Israel's restoration here. The same thing we saw back in chapter 5, where both houses were torn by God as the lion, leading to Israel's restoration. And again, this is the same motif here. He'll come against them as a lion, but this will result in their restoration, because in between comes their repentance. And in the second part of verse 10, the children should come trembling from the west. Now in verse 10 and the first part of 11, the regathering is coming from 3 directions. In verse 10, it's from the west. Such a regathering was only possible after 70 AD, when the Jews were dispersed towards the west. No earlier time were they dispersed to the west. They shall come trembling as a bird out of Egypt, and as a dove out of the land of Assyria. And I'll make them to dwell in their houses, says Jehovah. So secondly, we see they're going to come from the north, from Assyria. And thirdly, they're going to come from the south, which is Egypt. And God is going to restore them to their own land at the end of verse 11. Now, in all these subdivisions that we've seen so far, where we've seen the sins of Israel in chapter 4, verses 1 and 9, we saw the judgment and the return of Israel in 5:1 to 6:3. The rightness where we are now, the rightness of Israel for the judgment of destruction in 6:4 to 11:11. And the next one is the Israel's sin and God's salvation. In all of these, he begins along the same theme: Israel's sins leading to judgment, dealing with both an immediate judgment, the Assyrian captivity, and a distant judgment, the tribulation. So he's done it in each of these sections. But each section ends with God's love restored, and therefore Israel's restoration. And that's true for all four parts of this second division that we're in now, the message of Hosea's prophecies. So he always, it starts off with Israel's sins, then we have the judgment, immediate judgment, and a future judgment, and then it always ends with God's love restored, and therefore Israel's restoration. So we see Israel's sin and God's salvation in chapter 11:12 to chapter 14, verse 8. And we're going to see the contrast now with Jacob in 11:12 to 12:6. The point of this section here is to point out the difference between Jacob's attitude and the attitude of Jacob's descendants. And from chapter 11, verse 12 to chapter 12, verse 2, he first draws a contrast between the two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Israel, northern kingdom, Judah, the southern kingdom. Now, Israel, or sometimes we see it called Ephraim, she is characterized by falsehood. But in chapter 11, verse 12, Judah at this point in her history is still loyal to Jehovah. So in chapter 11, verse 12, Ephraim compasseth me about with falsehood, and the house of Israel with deceit. But Judah yet ruleth with God and is faithful with the Holy One. Now, chapter 12, verse 1, Ephraim feedeth on the wind and followeth after the east wind. He continually multiplieth lies and desolation. And they make a covenant with Assyria, and oil is carried into Egypt. Jehovah hath also a controversy with Judah, and will punish Jacob according to his ways. According to his doings will he recompense him. So what we see here is that in chapter 12, verse 1, Ephraim is characterized by lies. He's feeding on the wind. Well, what that means is that it's showing emptiness. He's showing emptiness. If you try to eat the wind, you don't feel very full. You're just empty. And so he multiplies lies, making schizophrenic covenants, vacillating from one direction to the other. But in verse 2, concerning Judah, although Judah for now is faithful to the Lord, she too is going to slip, and God will yet have a controversy that will result in judgment for Judah as well. In verse 3, in the womb, he took his brother by the heel. We're talking about Jacob here. He took his brother by the heel, and in his manhood he had power with God. Yea, he had power over the angel and prevailed. He wept and made supplication unto him. So in verses 3 to 4, he now begins comparing Israel with Jacob. When Jacob was still in the womb, he took his brother by the heel. And the picture here is that even in the womb, the two brothers were struggling. And Jacob's struggle was to gain the blessing. In his manhood, he had power with God, so as to overcome the angel. Yes, he had power over the angel and prevailed. He wept and made supplication unto him. And he says, I am not going to let you go until you bless me. He was looking for God's blessings. And we find that in Genesis 32, verses 22 to 32. Now, a little bit of history. God made a covenant with Abraham. Abraham had 8 sons, but the covenant with only one of his 8 sons, Isaac. Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. They were twins. Esau was born first, and therefore Esau had the birthright, and therefore he was the one to whom you would think that the covenant would be sustained. But as the boys grew up, Esau was characterized by one who has the birthright, but he didn't care much for it at all. He couldn't care less about being used by God, and he couldn't care less about being the one through whom the covenant is sustained. This is Esau. But Jacob, who doesn't have the birthright, is characterized by one who desires it deeply. And the picture we often get of Jacob from sermons is quite the opposite in the way he's portrayed in Genesis. Even the translating is a bit faulty and inconsistent. It says of Jacob in Genesis that he was a quiet man, while Esau is pictured as the strong one, the hunter. But the Hebrew word for quiet is the same word used of Job in the book of Job, where it is translated as a perfect man. Same word, quiet, perfect, same thing. So it should be translated the same way. In other words, Jacob was more like Job from God's perspective. He was a perfect man as far as his attitude and desires are concerned. And the attitude of the 2 brothers can be seen in the Esau that was willing to sell his birthright for a bowl of soup. His birthright. Later came the time of the patriarchal blessing, and the patriarchal blessing belongs to the one who had the birthright. Now, Esau has sold it to Jacob. Now, Jacob is often characterized as stealing the patriarchal blessing from Esau, but the opposite is actually true. Esau was trying to steal the patriarchal blessing from Jacob because it now belonged to Jacob, because Jacob had the birthright. Jacob's sin was in deceiving his father, not in stealing the patriarchal blessing. It was his to begin with. But that was the way Jacob was like. He was the one who sought, sometimes through the wrong means, but he sought very much to be the one God would use. Not only was there a struggle with the brother, it even led to a struggle with the angel, and he would not let the angel go until the angel blessed him. And the prophet points out he wept and made supplication for God's blessing, and he says there in Bethel, he experienced God. In the second part of verse 4, it says, he found him at Bethel. Jacob experienced God in Bethel twice. In Genesis 28, verses 11 to 22, he was on the way to Aram or Syria. He was heading up to Syria. And secondly, in Genesis 35, verses 1 to 15, on the way from Aram or Syria. You notice Hosea switches title from Beth Aven to Bethel, because in Hosea's day, Bethel had become Beth Aven, the house of vanity, house of emptiness. It was an idolatry center. But in Jacob's day, it was Bethel, the house of God. So that's why Hosea switches it around here. In verses 4 to 6, he draws the application of the lesson. And there he spake with us, even Jehovah, the God of hosts. Jehovah is his memorial name. Therefore, turn thou to thy God, keep kindness and justice, and wait for thy God continually. So just as God spoke to Jacob in Bethel, he speaks now to all Israel. In verse 5, he is the same God who has that unique name, the name I am. And in verse 6, like Jacob, Israel should also seek after God. They should turn and keep kindness, keep justice, and wait upon the Lord. The very same thing that Micah will say in chapter 6, verse 8, when we get there. Israel should be characterized by following in the footsteps of Jacob. But as he'll show next, Israel instead of becoming like Jacob, chose to become like a Canaanite. Now we see verses 7 to 14, Israel the Canaanite. In verse 7, he's a trafficker. The balances of deceit are in his hand. He loveth to oppress. And Ephraim said, surely I am become rich. I have found me wealth. In all my labors they shall find in me no iniquity that were sin. So in verses 7 to 14, rather than Israel becoming like Jacob, Israel became like a Canaanite. In verses 7 to 8, he draws a contrast here with Jacob. My translation here begins verse 7 with, he is the trafficker. Yours might be a little bit different. It might have, he is a merchant. But the word trafficker is actually the regular Hebrew word for Canaanite. And the point is that Israel has become a Canaanite. Now, there are two reasons why Jacob left the land of Israel for the land of Aram, which is Syria. One reason is because Esau was looking for an opportunity to kill him after he failed in stealing the patriarchal blessing from Jacob. The second reason is that Esau had begun intermarrying with the local girls, the Canaanites, and there was a tendency the Canaanites were far more persuasive concerning their idolatrous religion than Jews with their true religion. And so Isaac sent Jacob away from the land up to where Abraham originally came from in the area of Aram, where his family was, so he could now find a wife that would not be a Canaanite, but would be from amongst his own clan. So Jacob left the country to avoid becoming a Canaanite, while his descendant Israel, the nation of Israel, is now pursuing to become a Canaanite. Furthermore, Jacob also pursued the God who gave him wealth, while Israel was pursuing wealth, and as a result has lost God. Just as Abraham sought a wife for Isaac from the land of Aram, Isaac sent Jacob to find a wife, but not a Canaanite from the same territory. Israel, it says in verse 7, the balances of deceit are in his hand. He loves to oppress. So Israel was a deceiver whose highest aim was to become rich. And as if her pursuit of becoming a Canaanite was not enough in verse 8, Israel has made the assumption that she has escaped the judgment for her sin. And she goes around bragging, surely I'll become rich. I have found me wealth. Now, under Jeroboam II, the country was a very wealthy country. And that would be the last time Israel will be prosperous under Jeroboam II. But during his reign, it didn't seem like God was punishing the nation at all. And Israel took wealth as a sign of divine favor and declared at the end of verse 8, they shall find in me no iniquity that were sin. Now, Jacob, he gloried in God while Israel gloried in her wealth. Jacob was willing to recognize his sin, whereas Israel only her innocence. There's no sin found in me. He was anything but like Jacob of the earlier section. So because Israel has become unlike Jacob and like the Canaanites, in verses 9 to 11, there's going to be a judgment coming upon Israel. But I am Jehovah thy God from the land of Egypt. I will yet again make thee to dwell in tents as in the days of the solemn feasts. So in verse 9, he pronounces the fact that they're going to once again live in tents. Now, living in tents means they'll be living in temporary dwellings. They'll no longer live within their own land in permanent dwellings. They'll be living outside the land in temporary dwellings in tents. And the same point is made by Zechariah 12, verse 7. Zechariah 12, verse 7. They're going to be forced to live outside the land in temporary abodes. Now, for Israel, the major temporary abode will be, as we'll find it from Micah, it will be the city of Bozrah or Petra. The solemn feast here will be the Feast of Tabernacles. But whereas the Feast of Tabernacles, they only live in tents or booths for a few days, 8 days, in fact. When this judgment comes, it will be for a very long time, but it's going to still be temporary, just for a long time. And now in verse 10, I've also spoken unto the prophets, and I have multiplied visions, and by the ministry of the prophets have I used similitudes. In verse 11, is Gilead iniquity? They are altogether false. In Gilgal they sacrifice bullocks. Yea, their altars are as heaps in the furrows of the field. So what we see here in verse 10, this judgment is not coming to Israel by surprise, because they had received warnings by the prophets. And Hosea is one of them here. And the problem again is, as it has been throughout Hosea's book, lack of knowledge. And that is due to their rejection of the knowledge that was available to her. She rejected the prophets. And this rejection of true knowledge, which meant rejection of the prophetic message of the Jewish prophets, led in verse 11 to sin on both sides of the Jordan River. And again, he mentions Gilead, which is the Transjordan, which is on the east side of the river, across the river, and then Gilgal, which is in Cisjordan, or the west side of the Jordan River. Idolatry has become rampant on both sides of the Jordan. And Jacob fled into the field of Aram, and Israel served for a wife, and for a wife he kept sheep. And by a prophet, Jehovah brought Israel up out of Egypt, and by a prophet was he preserved. Ephraim hath provoked to anger most bitterly. Therefore shall his blood be left upon him, and his reproach shall his Lord return unto him. So in verses 12 to 14, he deals with 3 periods of Israel's history. Again, he's drawing a distinction here between Jacob of old and Israel of Hosea's day. The first period of infancy is the period of infancy in verse 12, where he pictures Jacob in Aram or Syria. And instead of marrying a Canaanite woman, he serves and he works for a wife in Aram. This was Israel in infancy. In verse 13, he deals with when Israel became a national son of God under Moses and the period of the Exodus, when they were brought out of Egypt. And the prophet that brought him out of Egypt was Moses. And at that point, Israel obtained adult sonship. However, when she reached into fuller manhood in verse 14, she was characterized by apostasy and now provoking God to anger. Ephraim hath provoked to anger most bitterly. And that's where we will end today. So contact details there. Study hard, grow strong.